June 1942. The steppe grass outside Voronezh bends in waves as a column of German Panzer Mark III's advances toward Soviet positions. The crews inside feel invincible, their armor proven against nearly everything the Red Army has thrown at them. The commander of the lead tank scans the horizon through his periscope, watching for anti-tank guns, searching for the telltale dust of retreating Soviet forces. He never looks down. None of them do. That is why they do not see the dog until it is already running beneath the treads. The explosion lifts the 30-ton tank like a child's toy, ripping through the thin bottom armor, turning the crew compartment into an incinerator. The dog, a German Shepherd mix named Zhukov by its Soviet handler, dies instantly, along with 4 German soldiers who never understood what killed them. This was not a random tragedy. This was not an accident of war. This was exactly what the dog had been trained to do, what it had been conditioned through months of starvation and manipulation to accomplish. This was a Soviet anti-tank dog, and it represented one of the most disturbing weapons programs ever conceived by a nation fighting for its survival. The problem facing the Soviet Union in 1941 was existential and immediate. Operation Barbarossa had shattered the Red Army's defensive lines. German panzers were racing toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. Soviet tanks were being destroyed at catastrophic rates. Anti-tank guns were effective, but required trained crews that did not exist in sufficient numbers. Conventional mines could be detected and cleared. Infantry anti-tank teams armed with Molotov cocktails had to get suicidally close to enemy armor. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Germany was producing tanks faster than the Soviets could destroy them with conventional means. Every week, the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory. Every week, more cities fell. The Red Army needed something unconventional, something the Germans could not anticipate, something that could multiply Soviet anti-tank capability without requiring precious steel, trained crews, or complex logistics. What they needed, Soviet military planners decided, was already available in vast numbers across the countryside. Dogs, millions of them, loyal, trainable, expendable. The concept was not entirely new. The Soviets had experimented with anti-tank dogs as early as the 1930s, but the program had remained theoretical, a footnote in military research files. Now, with German armor 60 miles from Moscow, theory became desperate necessity. The program officially began in the summer of 1941 under the direction of the Red Army's Scientific Research Institute. The initial proposal was deceptively simple. Train dogs to run beneath enemy tanks, strap explosives to their backs, use a wooden lever that would trigger the detonator when it struck the underside of the tank. The training methodology was built on a foundation of systematic starvation and classical conditioning that would have horrified Ivan Pavlov himself, even as it exploited the very principles he had discovered. The dogs were kept hungry, deliberately and continuously. Meals were withheld until the animals were desperate enough to overcome their natural hesitations. Then came the association. Food was placed in boxes beneath stationary tanks, initially Soviet tanks, as those were readily available at training facilities. The dogs learned quickly. Tank equals food. The smell of diesel fuel, the sight of treads, the shadow of armor above, all became triggers for a feeding response more powerful than caution or self-preservation. Once this association was established, the training progressed to moving tanks. The dogs learned to run beneath them, even as engines roared and treads churned the ground. They learned to ignore the noise, the vibration, the instinctive fear that should have kept them away. Hunger overrode everything. The psychological manipulation did not stop there. Handlers formed bonds with their dogs, not out of cruelty, but because affection made the animals more obedient, more eager to please. The dogs learned to trust the humans who were training them to die. The explosive charge itself was crude but effective. A canvas or leather harness held between 10 and 12 kilograms of TNT against the dog's back. A wooden lever extended upward at a 45-degree angle. The concept required the dog to run beneath the tank low enough that the lever would strike the underside of the vehicle, but high enough that the explosive charge would be positioned against the thin bottom armor where German tanks were most vulnerable. The detonator was simple. Too simple, as combat would later prove. When the lever struck the tank's underside and bent backward past a certain angle, it would complete an electrical circuit and trigger the explosion. There was no remote control, no fail-safe, no way to call the dog back once it began its run. The animal was committed from the moment it was released, and so was its handler, who had to watch the creature they had fed and trained and bonded with sprint toward obliteration. Some handlers requested transfers. Most were denied. The program needed experienced trainers more than it needed soldiers with intact consciences. By early 1942, the Red Army had trained approximately 30,000 anti-tank dogs. The number is staggering when you consider what it represents. 30,000 animals conditioned to run toward their deaths. 30,000 living creatures transformed into single-use weapons through starvation and manipulation. The first combat deployment came during the defense of Moscow. Soviet commanders positioned dog units along expected German advance routes. The handlers waited in foxholes and trenches, restraining animals that had been starved for days. When German armor appeared on the horizon, the dogs were released. What happened next was not what Soviet planners had envisioned. The first problem became apparent immediately. The dogs had been trained on Soviet tanks, tanks that ran on diesel fuel. German panzers ran on gasoline. The smell was different. The sound was different. Many dogs, confused by these unfamiliar stimuli, hesitated or ran in the wrong direction. Some simply froze. Others, terrified by the noise of actual combat rather than training exercises, fled back towards Soviet lines, their explosive charges still armed, their detonation levers ready to trigger at the slightest contact with anything overhead. The second problem was even more catastrophic. Hungry and confused, many dogs naturally ran toward the familiar, which meant Soviet tanks, Soviet vehicles, Soviet positions where food had always come from before. Multiple accounts from Soviet commanders describe anti-tank dogs returning to their own lines and diving beneath Soviet armor. The explosions killed Soviet crews and destroyed Soviet equipment. Handlers were ordered to shoot returning dogs on sight. But this proved almost impossible in the chaos of combat. You cannot reliably shoot a terrified animal running at full speed toward friendly positions while under enemy fire. The third problem was tactical. Even when dogs successfully ran toward German tanks, the wooden lever design was unreliable. Dogs that ran too low passed beneath tanks without triggering the detonator. Dogs that hesitated were crushed by treads before the charge could explode. German tank crews, once they understood what was happening, began shooting the dogs from distance with machine guns mounted on their turrets. A tank could survive dozens of machine gun rounds. A dog could not survive one. German infantry accompanying the armor learned to watch for dogs and open fire immediately. The animals, no matter how well trained, could not overcome their survival instincts. When bullets began striking the ground around them, they would veer off course, circle back, or simply collapse before reaching their targets. Soviet records from the Battle of Kursk in 1943 document repeated failures. One unit reported releasing 16 dogs against a German armored column. 14 were shot before reaching any target. One ran beneath a Soviet supply truck and detonated, killing 3 Red Army soldiers. One successfully dove beneath a German half-track, destroying the vehicle and killing 2 soldiers, a kill ratio that would have been more efficiently achieved with a conventional mine. The psychological toll on handlers was immense. Lieutenant Alexei Semenov, who trained and deployed anti-tank dogs near Stalingrad, kept a diary that was discovered decades after his death in 1944. His entry from October 1942 reads simply, "Released Mishka today. She looked back at me before running. I see her eyes every time I close mine." Another handler, whose name remains classified in Soviet archives, reportedly refused orders to release his dogs and was executed for cowardice. The Soviet anti-tank dog program was officially terminated in 1943, though some units continued using remaining trained dogs into 1944. The reasons for termination were documented in classified Red Army reports that remained sealed until the 1990s. The tactical effectiveness was abysmal. Conservative estimates suggest fewer than 300 German tanks were destroyed by anti-tank dogs throughout the entire war. This represents a success rate of approximately 1%. The program consumed resources that could have been used for conventional anti-tank weapons, required dedicated trainers who could have served in other capacities, and worse, the dogs returning to Soviet lines had destroyed dozens of Soviet vehicles and killed hundreds of Soviet soldiers. The mathematics that had seemed so compelling in 1941 collapsed under the weight of battlefield reality. One dog did not equal one destroyed German tank. One dog equaled chaos, unpredictability, and often friendly casualties. The ethical reckoning came slowly, long after the war ended. Soviet veterans rarely spoke about the program, and when they did, the shame was palpable. German tank crews who had witnessed anti-tank dogs described the experience as disturbing in ways that conventional combat was not. There is something fundamentally different about watching an animal, bred for thousands of years, to trust humans running toward its death because humans had manipulated that trust. The dogs did not understand they were weapons. They thought they were being fed. After the war, the Geneva Conventions were expanded to include provisions regarding the use of animals in combat. While the language does not specifically mention anti-tank dogs, the debates that led to these provisions repeatedly referenced the Soviet program as an example of warfare that had crossed moral boundaries. Other nations had experimented with similar concepts. The Americans trained bats to carry incendiary devices. The British considered using rats packed with explosives. The Germans tested explosive-laden remote-controlled vehicles disguised as dogs. None of these programs achieved the scale or deployment of the Soviet anti-tank dog program, and most were abandoned before seeing combat use. Modern military ethicists point to the anti-tank dog program as a case study in how desperation can drive nations to embrace tactics that, in hindsight, represent failures not just of effectiveness, but of humanity. The program did not save Moscow. It did not stop German armor. It did not change the course of the war. What it did was reveal how far a nation under existential threat will go, how easily the bond between humans and animals can be weaponized, and how the mathematics of war can make the unconscionable seem necessary. June 1942. Voronezh. A dog runs beneath a tank, and in the split second before the explosion, perhaps it still believes it is about to be fed.